Somber Teacup Chronicles presents Arcane Academia.
Morning, students. How's everyone today? Hope you're doing well. Professor VonCraft is still not back, but I'm sure he is hoping that you're all staying safe. There have been some incidents on campus lately. Disappearances and attempted break-ins to the archives in Professor VonCraft's office. Now, I need to pass a psychological test in order to enter the archives now. The door to VonCraft's office is now barricaded and under 24-hour watch. I barely had any time to set up the lecture for today. I asked Director Sullivan if he knew anything about the whereabouts of Professor VonCraft. He suggested that I ask his lab assistant, Tim, but he still doesn't know. Tim said that the professor looked nervous and a bit jumpy, which is odd. I honestly had no idea that this class or the university was in such a state of chaos when I applied to be the substitute teacher here. It's been a little tense in the archives, and I've been hearing strange whispers from behind the shelves. When I go to investigate, there's no one there. I'm amazed that any of the staff is able to sleep with all this bizarre stuff going on. TAR must be tense, too, because they keep sending armed guards to check up on me. They have been keeping their distance, and have been doing checkups in the middle of the night, but it's starting to get on my nerves. We should really be getting on with our lecture now, though. Sorry for wasting everyone's time. This lecture will be over a well-known creature called a Siren. You may think that mermaids and sirens are the same, but they're actually two different entities. A mermaid witch is popular in since the Rupture is an aquatic, beautiful, non-violent creature. A siren, on the other hand, is quite the opposite in almost every way. The siren is a very beautiful winged woman that sometimes resembles a harpy, but they're significantly more intelligent. These roles are usually concrete, but there have been some accounts of mermaids with a very sadistic nature. The case we have is a copy of an old journal entry of the nephew of a trade ship that we believe was in contact with the infamous East Coast Sirens. The copy of the writings are all that we have now left of James Easton. My access to this information was deeply restricted by the university. There are several pages that were missing and words that were smeared or scratched out. James Easton's case file reads as stated.
Journal entry, March 24th, 1712. I miss my little sister, Isabella. All I have to remember her by is this journal that she has given me to write down my experiences. It has been a long and stressful voyage to the New World. We are all running out of supplies and there's no land in sight. There are whispers among the crew of a possible mutiny. The supplies are dwindling, and I am afraid if our luck does not turn around soon, the captain, my uncle, will be killed. It is only a matter of time before we reach a boiling point. I only hope that I live long enough to see my little sister again and to feel the earth underneath my feet one more time. I only hope that I live long enough to see my little sister again, and to feel the earth underneath my feet one more time. I have risked everything for adventure and profit after my uncle asked me to join him on his ship. I hope this journal is not the only thing that I leave behind, the only thing to return to my sister. I have been seeing something flying over the distance for a couple days now. I do not wish to get my hopes up, and I believe that the sea madness is getting to me. It looks like large birds. I hope that my eyes are not playing tricks on me, because that means that land is not far away. Journal entry, April 1st, 1712. There was a vicious storm last night. The waves hit the boat like cannonballs. My uncle shouted at us to raise the sails. The mast of the boat was creaking and groaning. I could hear the cracking of wood all around me. Parts of the boat would explode from the stress and splinters would shower us. By the time we finally got the sails up, there was already significant damage to the boat. We were soaked to the bone. Lightning flashed in the sky and I could see shapes. They looked like giant birds, but something was a little different about them. For a moment I could have sworn that they had the figure of a woman. I rubbed my eyes and they were gone. I felt a hand on my shoulder. One of my shipmates snapped me out of my daze. The storm raged on, and I was heading inside to the lower parts of the ship to get shelter from the rain. I heard something that sounded like singing, coming from everywhere. I could not tell exactly where it was, but it felt like it was coming from all around us. It was faint, but I could hear that it was a woman's voice. I turned around and saw that some of my fellow shipmates had begun to huddle near the port side of the ship, look out into the sea. Some of the other shipmates on the starboard side began to join them. Lightning flashed in the sky and I could see shapes. They looked like giant birds, but something was different about them. For a moment I could have sworn that they had a figure of a woman. I rubbed my eyes and they were gone. I felt a hand on my shoulder that belonged to one of the shipmates. He snapped me out of my daze. I heard something that sounded like singing coming from all around us. It was faint, but I could hear that it sounded like a woman's voice. I turned around and saw that some of my fellow shipmates had begun to huddle near the port side of the ship and look out into the sea. Some of them from the starboard side joined them. I felt a hand on my shoulder as I was about to call out to the crew. I turned around and saw that it was the ship's doctor. He was an old man with a dark beard and long dark hair. His eyes were a deep green. There was a large scar above his eyebrow. It was jagged but not deep. He gripped my shoulder tightly, his knuckles turning white. I shouted to him to let me go, but he said something to me. I couldn't make it out over the storm. He pointed to the sailors, and I saw dark figures flying out in front of the men. They were beautiful, dark-haired women with legs and wings of a bird. Two more similar figures joined the one that was flying near the shipmates. They continued to sing. I watched as one of the men began to climb on the railing of the ship as the woman reached out her feathery wing for one of the men to grab. They beckoned them to join them in the sky. The man jumped off the boat towards the woman. The woman pulled away, and the man fell into the sea, screaming. The other men did not react. They all had the same blank look on their faces. I shouted for the doctor to let me help them. He shook his head and shouted to me that they were already lost. I watched helplessly as the other men began to stand on the railing and jump into the sea. 13 men were lost that day. If it wasn't for the doctor, I would have been the 14th. None of the men screamed for help as they were dragged into the briny deep. The one thing that was burned into my mind was laughing. The devilish creatures laughed at my crew as they jumped into the ocean and drowned. The doctor pulled me into the ship. I shivered from the rain and fear of what I just witnessed. My hands could not stop shaking as I leaned against one of the walls of the ship. He asked me to follow him. He knew I wanted answers, and I could tell that he had them. The quartermaster was down in the ship and saw the doctor. The doctor gave him a nod, and he followed us into the doctor's quarters. The doctor sat me down on his bed and pulled out a small black book and began to scribble a bunch of notes. The quartermaster folded his arm and looked down at me. He began to ask me a couple questions. I did not respond to any of them. I was still haunted by those horrible laughs. The doctor looked up and said that there was an incident, and that Sirens had seduced 13 men into taking their own lives. The quartermaster seemed surprised and then furious. He kicked a small chest near the foot of the bed. I jumped, surprised, and so did the doctor. The quartermaster soon calmed down. He said that he did not want to share this dreadful news with my uncle and the first mate. I asked about the Sirens. I only heard stories about them, but I had no idea that there was some truth to them. The doctor nodded his head and looked at the quartermaster for a moment before responding to me. He told me that over his lifetime sailing, that he has seen many things that others would consider unnatural. My uncle heard about the doctor's experience with monsters and considered him as part of the crew because he was unaware of what they would encounter on their voyage. The doctor slowly to recount some of the monsters that he encountered over the years. I did not sleep that night. Journal entry, April 2nd, 1712. Today, the first mate and my uncle told the crew that 13 men were lost at sea and swept overboard. The crew and I bowed our heads in silence. I wanted to speak up then, but my uncle had visited my quarters and told me to remain silent about the events that had transpired last night. After our moment of silence, I went down into the ship to talk to the doctor. The doctor was surprised to see me and stopped writing in his book. He turned to me and gestured to a stool that he had. I sat down and I began to talk to him. I asked him what he knew about the Sirens, and he eyed me closely. He looked at the door before he began to speak quietly. He told me that Sirens were very bad luck and to never mention them on a ship. I asked where the Sirens came from, and he sat up. He told me that they lived in coves on land. He thinks that we were getting close to our destination. He did tell me not to get excited because there would be more. He would get more bold and ravenous the closer we got to land. I felt my blood run cold as he told me that. I asked him what we could possibly do. The doctor rubbed his eyes and sighed. He told me that he had something that would help block out their music. He said that he learned it from an old story called The Odyssey by Homer. He said that it works, and he will be handing it out to the crew. He's not sure if any of them will accept it. I struggled to sleep that night. I kept waking up to the sounds of seagulls calling outside. I should be overjoyed about getting closer to the shore, but I felt a pit in my stomach growing. I tried to sleep through the night, but the sound of the Sirens laughing echoed in my mind. After many failed attempts at sleeping, I finally got out of my bed in a cold sweat. My hands were trembling and I tried to focus. My vision was a bit blurry and I wiped the sleep out of my eyes. I got out of my sleeping quarters and I began to walk up the stairs of the ship. I saw the quartermaster over the side of the boat with something in his hands. He had a lantern on the floor of the ship. He turned around, surprised, and almost dropped his bottle. He gave me a friendly smile and waved me over to join him. He handed me the bottle and told me to take a sip. He told me that tomorrow is the day that we would be arriving. I asked the quartermaster if he was worried. He nodded his head and showed me the letter. He said that it was a letter from his wife. He told me that he carried it wherever he went as a reminder that he still had something to go back to. Something to keep him from falling prey to the Siren song. He asked if I had something to keep me focused. I told him about my little sister. We talked for a while and waited for the sun to rise. The quartermaster handed me something. He called it beeswax and said that he gave it to all of the shipmates to protect them from the Sirens. He took the beeswax and I put some of it in my ears. It muffled the sound all around me. I hoped it was enough to block out the Siren's song. The quartermaster said that the doctor tested it out himself on one of his voyages. Journal entry, April 3rd, 1712. It was noon when things began to happen on the ship. I was looking around, feeling my skin crawling. Then, there was a shadow, a slight gust of wind. I looked at the sky and saw a seagull. I let out a shaky breath of relief and gripped the side of the boat, feeling sick. I felt like I was going to throw up, and then I felt someone touching my shoulder. I turned around and I felt my blood go cold. I was looking into the eyes of a siren. They were a deep blue-green, and I could feel she was looking deep inside me. She smiled and began to sing. I felt her wing digging into my chest as she began to push me overboard. I gripped the railing, and the siren looked at me angrily. She flapped her wings and took off. She scratched at me with her claws, and I could feel it digging into my flesh. I felt her strong talons digging into my back and shoulders and scraping against the bone. All I remember was screaming, and then everything went dark. I woke up feeling the wind across my face, and I found myself hanging upside down from the mast. My leg was tangled up in the ropes. Blood was flowing from my shoulder onto the deck as my crewmates panicked. I watched as one of the crewmates was picked up by two Sirens. They began to pull on him. They began to rip him in half and tossed the remaining parts into the ocean. They giggled with glee as the rest of the crewmates tried to hide into the ship. They giggled with glee as the rest of the crew tried to hide in the ship. They began picking them off one by one, ripping and tearing until there was nothing left. I struggled to untangle myself from the rope. I managed to climb down the mast by using a ladder attached to the mast of the ship. The Sirens noticed me and began to try and pull me off the ladder, to my death. I heard a gunshot, and the Sirens began to scatter. They let go, and I used the last of my strength to keep me from falling. The last thing I remember was someone grabbing my shoulders, and I felt my body being dragged somewhere. I woke up in the doctor's room. I was covered in bandages, so the bleeding would stop. I tried to get up, but the doctor pushed me down gently. He shook his head and said that they were gone. I asked him what had happened, and the doctor told me that the Sirens had scattered after they shot their muskets. I breathed a heavy sigh of relief, but then I asked how many were lost. The doctor closed his eyes as I got up. He rubbed the back of his neck and then looked back at his black book. He said that they lost 5. He said that we were on land and they were safe from the Sirens, at least for now. The ride back should be a smoother trip. Journal entry, June 13th, 1712. I spent a while in the ship's infirmary while I healed. The quartermaster was kind enough to hand me my journal. I was given a bunch of ink and a pen to write down about my misadventure. I was able to come ashore to the New World briefly before we began our return trip. I can't wait to tell my sister everything. I'm currently in a carriage on a return trip from the doctor's manor, where we talked about everything that had happened. I have seen his study. It was beyond anything that I have ever seen before. I wondered if it all belonged to him, or if it was a collection of him and all of his fellow scholars. I managed to pick something out for my little sister. It was a strange stone with a hole in the center. There were strange carvings in the stone. The doctor called it a hag stone. I wonder if what he said was true, and that we could see into another world with it. The doctor gave me something else before I left. A letter. He said that I could read it in the carriage on the way home. He said that it was an invitation to learn. I'm a little unsure if I will accept his invitation to be part of his crusade against the ARCANE.
Welcome back, class. Now you know the Sirens are very challenging creatures to deal with. They possess very high levels of intelligence, speed, and strength. Over centuries, they have faded into myth, but some stray sailors will occasionally run into the nest of them. Tar has had to sink the ghost ships left behind in order to prevent any further suspicion. The university was very hesitant to pursue and collect any modern research on these entities. For now, Sirens are still kept at a distance, but I have heard talks from the university that they may try some diplomacy with the East Coast Sirens. If they are successful, this could be a very large step forward in human and inhuman relations. I know that Professor VonCraft does not educate the idea of human and inhuman communication, but I believe that some of these creatures are harmless. I believe that others in the university believe so as well. For example, I met this nice old man who was sitting on a bench outside the... Ow! Did someone point a laser in my eye? Man, I suddenly had this splitting headache. I think I need to go rest for a little bit now. Class is dismissed. Everyone have a good day.